So I'm focusing on methods and specifically the different kinds of parameters that you get in C#. You'll see the read to numbers have out parameters. Display to numbers have the default parameters, or sometimes we call them in. Update max has, the first one is a reference or ref parameter, and then the fourth one is where we return data via the method itself. So it's not the getMax is not a void method, it's an int method. We'll look at each one of these separately. Okay, so the first method we look at is read to numbers, which has two out parameters. So notice in the main method, we call the method read to numbers, and we've got two variables declared a and b. So when we call read to numbers, a and b does not have any values yet. Okay, so when we kind of arrive in the method read to numbers after it's been called, the first thing we notice is that the parameters obviously are out parameters, but their names are now C and D. Please note they don't need to be the same names as from where they were called. So what literally happens is that the first parameter maps onto the first and the second onto the second. So because they are out parameters, C and D are not two variables inside method read to numbers. They are simply two pointers that point back to A and B, the two variables in the main method. So they point to that, they are not separate variables in read to numbers. So what happens now, the user in the method first enters a 7, and because C points to the variable A in the main method, that variable changes to 7. And the same happens when the user enters a 10 for D. So that variable changes to a 10. So it's very important to note here that what happens here is that the two parameters C and D are used to take values out of the method back to the main method. So as C and D changes inside read to numbers, it changes the values of A and B in the main method. So the data flows from read to numbers back to the main method. The second method we look at is display to numbers. We've called read to numbers. It has come back from that method, and now it has the values 7 and 10, A and B. And now we send A and B into display to numbers. Notice it's default parameters, or called the in parameters. The matching parameters inside method display to numbers are F and G. Because they're not reference or out parameters, we now create two variables, F and G, and they simply take on the values 7 and 10. So the value of 7 of A is copied into F, and the value 10 of B is copied into G. So you can see here we've got a movement of data from the main method into method display to numbers. So the two parameters we could call in parameters, or basically its default. An important thing to notice here is what happens if F inside display to numbers is now changed to 15. So the variable F inside that method changes to 15, but because it's a default parameter or an in parameter, it has no impact on the variable A inside the main method. So it's different to the out parameters we had previously. Now I'm introducing the reference parameter. Notice what happens in the main method. We initialize max to -9999. Then we call update max. Now the idea here is that we send through this -999 and the value of A7, and we expect it to come back and change max to 7. And then we call update max with the 10, and we expect max to be 10. So every time the second parameter is bigger than max, we expect max to change. So notice what happens inside update max. Because it's a reference parameter, you can see it as an arrow pointing both ways. So when you come at the if statement, if num is greater than max, Num obviously takes on the value of 7, which maps onto the a in the main method, and max, because it's a reference parameter, takes on the value minus 9999. So in this case, the max parameter is used to bring a value into the method. And that is done in the if statement, where we compare num and max, the two values that were in the main method. Obviously num would be greater than max, so the if statement is true, and therefore we say max is assigned to num. But because max is a reference parameter, it's a pointer back to the max variable in the main method, which now changes to 7. So the important thing to note here is that the reference int max parameter was initially used to bring the minus 999 into the method, and now it's used to take the changed value of max out of the method. And that's what a reference parameter is. It's used to take value in and out of a method. So when we now go to the second call of update max, when we arrive into update max, the if statement now compares num, which is 10, to the latest value of max, which is 7. And because 10 is greater than 7, max is assigned to the new value to num, and therefore max in the main method becomes 10. Once again, the max parameter was used to bring a value in this case 7, and to take a value out, in this case 10. But there's another way of finding max. In this case, in the main method, we simply say, let's call the method called getMax, which takes two variables, in this case 7 and 10, and returns the maximum one. So the way it's called, you'll see in the main method. Notice that the variable max is uninitialized at this stage. It does not have a value when you call getMax. So when we go into method getMax, the first thing we note is that getMax is not a void method, it is an int method. And the logic there says if x is greater than y, return x, else return y. Because y is greater, the bottom return y will apply. What does that mean? It means the value 10 is returned via the name of the method. Int getMax takes back the value 10, and when we can return back to the main method, getMax now has the value 10, which is then assigned to the variable max.